6 executives laughed when a woman in a faded green cardigan asked if she could sit at the reserved table near the stage. A junior partner, 2 glasses of champagne in, told her the table was for people who'd actually built the company. She didn't argue. She found a folding chair near the kitchen doors and sat quietly with a paper plate she never touched. 40 minutes later, the chairman of the entire firm knelt in front of that same folding chair, in his $3,000 suit, and said, in front of the whole ballroom, "Mom, why are you sitting all the way back here?" If stories about quiet dignity and instant consequences move you, tap like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. It genuinely helps. Ruth Calloway was 68, and for 4 decades she had asked almost nothing of anyone. She'd raised her son Nathaniel alone in a 2-bedroom Newark apartment after his father left before he turned 2, working double shifts as a seamstress by day and taking in alterations at night just to cover rent. She never remarried, never complained, and never let Nathaniel see how close they sometimes came to not making it. Nathaniel noticed everything she tried to hide, which is why he grew into a man who worked harder than anyone asked him to. He studied finance on scholarships, slept 4 hours a night through his 20s, and by 38 was chairman of Ashford Meridian, a private equity firm managing $11 billion in assets. He never forgot where he came from, he simply stopped talking about it, the way successful people sometimes do, and the silence became a habit he never examined. He flew Ruth out twice a year and called her every Sunday. For 3 years he'd been quietly planning the one promise he'd made her at 19, doing homework by a second-hand lamp, a proper retirement, a house with no landlord, a seat at whatever table he ended up sitting at. Tonight, Ashford Meridian's 10th anniversary gala, its best year on record, was the night he planned to make it real, announcing a scholarship fund in her name for single mothers in the garment trade she'd spent her life working in. Ruth flew in that morning wearing the green cardigan she'd owned 11 years, because it still fit. No one gave her a seating card at the door, an oversight, not malice, the kind of gap that happens when 20 staff are managing 400 guests. She found the reserved table near the stage, assumed correctly it was Nathaniel's team, and asked politely if there was room. Preston Ambrose was 29, sharp with numbers, sharper with champagne than he should have been that night. He'd joined the firm after Nathaniel had stopped mentioning his mother in casual conversation, and had never seen a photograph of her. He looked at the cardigan, the flat shoes, the plain handbag, and made the kind of lazy judgment people make when they've learned to read appearance as information. "This table's reserved for senior leadership," he said, loud enough that 2 colleagues laughed before he'd finished. "There's probably seating near the back." Another added, "Unless you're catering," and the laugh that followed was the kind a room gives when it's decided, together, that someone doesn't warrant courtesy. Ruth didn't argue. She'd spent a lifetime being underestimated by people who mistook modest clothes for a modest life, and she'd learned decades ago that dignity didn't need loud defending. She said, "Of course, I understand," and walked to a folding chair by the kitchen doors, watching the room from its farthest edge the way she'd watched most rooms her whole life. Nathaniel had been in a side hallway reviewing his remarks, checking that the scholarship fund announcement was set up correctly on the stage screen. He walked back into the ballroom just in time to miss the exchange, and just in time to notice, scanning the room out of habit, a familiar green cardigan sitting alone near the kitchen doors. It took him 3 seconds to understand what he was looking at. Then something in his chest went cold. He crossed the ballroom faster than protocol allowed, knelt in front of the folding chair in a suit worth more than his mother's entire wardrobe, and took both her hands. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying further than he meant it to, because the room had gone silent the moment the chairman knelt on the floor in front of a woman in a cardigan. "Why are you sitting all the way back here?" Ruth's face showed pride and embarrassment at once, the specific discomfort of a mother who never wanted her son making a scene for her. "There was a mix-up, sweetheart. I didn't want to make a fuss." "You don't need to," Nathaniel said, standing, still holding her hand. He turned to the room, and 400 people watched a man who ran $11 billion visibly decide how much of himself to show a crowd he usually kept at a careful distance. "This is my mother, Ruth Calloway," he said, "steady now, pitched to carry. She raised me alone on a seamstress's salary in a 2-bedroom apartment in Newark. Every deal on every slide tonight exists because a woman who owns one cardigan worked double shifts so I could finish homework under a second-hand lamp. I was seconds from announcing a scholarship fund in her name for women exactly like her. I still am. But first, my mother is moving to the seat beside mine, where she should have been seated the moment she walked in." Preston went the color of the tablecloth. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have made it worse, and everyone at that table understood exactly what they'd done, and who'd been close enough to hear it. Nathaniel didn't fire him on the spot. He recognized the impulse as the heat of the moment, not a clear decision. He walked Ruth to the seat beside his, gave his remarks, announced the fund to genuine applause, and let the evening continue, because his mother had spent her life avoiding scenes and he wasn't going to turn her humiliation into a bigger one. He addressed it 2 days later instead, calling Preston into his office not to fire him, but to ask one question that had been sitting in his own chest since the ballroom. "Would you have said any of that if you'd known who she was?" Preston didn't defend himself. He said no, immediately, and sat with how uncomfortable that answer was. Nathaniel didn't accept an apology as the end of it. He told Preston the firm would start a mandatory partnership with organizations supporting single mothers in trade work, sewing cooperatives, hospitality staff, home health aides, and every junior partner, starting with him, would spend 1 weekend a quarter actually present with them, not writing checks from a distance. It wasn't punishment dressed up as punishment. It was, Nathaniel said, an education most of his team had skipped on their way to the top. Ruth moved into the house Nathaniel had already quietly bought her, 3 months later, on a street with trees old enough to shade the whole block. She kept the green cardigan, and wore it to the scholarship fund's ribbon cutting the following spring, standing beside her son as the first 6 recipients, young single mothers working double shifts of their own, crossed a stage to receive checks that would let them finish what Ruth never had the chance to. She didn't give a speech. She simply stood there, in the cardigan nobody at that gala had thought belonged near the stage, and let herself take up exactly as much room as she deserved. It's strange how quickly a room decides who matters based on almost nothing, a cardigan, the absence of a seating card. The people who laughed weren't unusually cruel. They were doing what most of us do without noticing, sorting the world into who's worth our time, based on surfaces that tell us almost nothing true. Ruth didn't need her son's title to deserve that seat. She'd earned it decades earlier, at a sewing machine, in a kitchen with one working lamp, long before anyone in that ballroom knew her name. The chairman didn't give his mother dignity that night. He simply made sure the room finally saw what had been there all along. If this reminded you to look twice before judging someone by what they're wearing, subscribe so more stories like this find you. Tell us in the comments, has someone ever misjudged you, or someone you love, before learning the truth? Take care of the people the room overlooks. We'll see you in the next one.